The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Why should we listen to someone so useless? My own grandson, my flesh and blood, had just spoken those words across a restaurant table, his voice dripping with contempt that I never thought possible from a 12-year-old boy. But what happened next, what his parents did next, that's what nearly broke me completely. They laughed. My son Michael and his wife Sarah, the same son I'd worked 3 jobs to put through college, the same son whose mortgage I'd co-signed when the banks wouldn't touch him, they threw their heads back and laughed like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. The sound echoed through that busy Italian restaurant, mixing with the clatter of dishes and the hum of other families enjoying their Sunday lunch. Normal families. Families where grandfathers weren't being publicly humiliated by the very people they'd sacrificed everything for. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal from those you love most, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. That hollow feeling in your chest, like someone reached in and scooped out your heart with a rusty spoon. But if this story resonates with you, if you understand what it's like to be cast aside by your own family, then please, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next changed everything, and I need people to hear this. I need witnesses to what I discovered, what I did, and what it cost me. The whole nightmare started 3 months earlier, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I was 63 years old, recently retired after 42 years managing a small construction company in Ohio. My wife Helen had passed 2 years prior, and I was still learning how to navigate the world without her steady presence beside me. The house felt too big, too quiet, and I found myself reaching for the phone more often, calling Michael just to hear a familiar voice. That's when the Sunday lunches began. Michael suggested them, actually, which should have been my first warning sign. My son had never been one for regular family gatherings, always too busy with work, with his social life, with anything that didn't involve spending time with his old man. But suddenly, he was insisting on these weekly meals at Romano's, this upscale Italian place downtown where the portions were small and the prices made my Depression-era sensibilities wince. I should have been suspicious. I should have asked myself why my son, who used to complain about the cost of a movie ticket, was suddenly eager to drop $80 on lunch every Sunday. But I was lonely, and I was grateful. When you're grieving and isolated, you don't question unexpected kindness. You just grab onto it like a life preserver and hope it's real. For those first few weeks, it felt wonderful. Ethan, my grandson, would chatter about school and his soccer team. Sarah would ask about my garden, my health, my plans for the week. Michael would share stories from his job at the marketing firm, making me feel included in his adult world in a way I hadn't experienced since he was a teenager. We'd sit there in those burgundy leather booths, surrounded by the warm lighting and soft jazz, and for an hour or two, I'd forget that I was alone in the world. But families, I've learned, are like icebergs. You only see the tip floating above the surface. The real mass of it, the dangerous part, stays hidden beneath, waiting to tear your hull wide open. The first crack in the facade came during our 4th Sunday lunch. Ethan had been telling me about a science project, something involving volcanoes and baking soda, when Michael's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and immediately answered, despite being in the middle of a conversation with his son. "Yeah, this is Michael." "No, I can't talk right now, I'm at lunch with," "Hold on." He covered the phone and looked at me with barely concealed irritation. "Dad, can you keep it down? This is important." I hadn't realized I was speaking loudly. Hell, I hadn't been speaking at all. I'd been listening to Ethan. But I nodded and watched as my son conducted a 10-minute business call right there at our family table, leaving his wife to stare at her phone and his son to fidget with his napkin in uncomfortable silence. When he finally hung up, he didn't apologize. He just picked up his fork and continued eating as if nothing had happened. As if his family's time meant nothing. As if my time meant nothing. That was the moment I should have recognized the pattern forming. The subtle eye rolls when I'd repeat a story. The way Sarah would check her watch when I'd mentioned something about Helen. The increasing frequency of Michael's emergency phone calls during our meals. The way Ethan started bringing his Nintendo DS to lunch, his attention fixed on the tiny screen instead of our conversation. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was reading too much into innocent behavior. After all, they were still showing up every Sunday. They were still making time for the old man. That had to count for something, right? The truth is, I was desperate to believe they loved me. Desperate enough to ignore every warning sign, every red flag, every small cruelty that should have prepared me for what was coming. Because what happened that final Sunday, what my grandson said, what my son and daughter-in-law did, that wasn't an accident. That wasn't a moment of lost temper or poor judgment. That was the culmination of months of growing resentment, months of planning, months of deciding that I was nothing more than a burden they could mock publicly and discard privately. And the worst part? The absolute worst part was that they'd been setting me up for it all along. The Sunday that changed everything started like all the others had in recent weeks, with me arriving 15 minutes early, eager as a puppy waiting for its owner to come home. I'd spent Saturday evening pressing my good shirt, polishing my shoes, and planning conversation topics that might interest a 12-year-old boy. Pathetic, really, when I look back on it. A grown man, a grandfather who'd raised 2 children of his own, desperately rehearsing ways to connect with his own flesh and blood. I was already seated at our usual booth when they arrived, and immediately I sensed something different. There was an electricity in the air between them, a shared energy that felt both exciting and exclusive. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances that seemed to carry secret messages, while Ethan bounced in his seat with barely contained anticipation. They looked like conspirators, and I was clearly not part of the conspiracy. "You're early again, Dad," Michael said as he slid into the booth across from me. There was something in his tone, not quite irritation, but close to it. As if my punctuality was somehow problematic. "Traffic was light," I replied, though the truth was I'd been ready to leave for an hour. These Sunday lunches had become the highlight of my week, the one thing I looked forward to during the long, empty days that stretched between them. Sarah settled in next to her husband, and I noticed she was wearing a new dress, something expensive looking in deep blue silk. Michael had on a shirt I'd never seen before, crisp white cotton with French cuffs. Even Ethan was dressed better than usual, in khakis and a polo shirt instead of his typical jeans and t-shirt. They looked like they were dressed for something special, something important. Something that required witnesses. "You all look nice today," I said, trying to sound casual. "Special occasion?" "Not really," Sarah answered, but she exchanged another one of those loaded glances with Michael. "We just felt like dressing up." The waiter came over, a young man named Tony who'd been serving us for weeks. Usually, he'd greet me warmly, ask about my week, treat me like the regular customer I'd become. But today, he barely acknowledged my presence. His attention was entirely focused on Michael and Sarah, as if they'd become the important people at the table and I'd been demoted to background noise. "The usual for everyone?" Tony asked, but he was looking at Michael, not me. In the past, the waiter had always asked me first, a small courtesy extended to the eldest at the table. Today, I might as well have been invisible. "Actually," Michael said, leaning back in the booth with a confidence I hadn't seen in him before, "I think we're going to try something different today. Dad, why don't you just order for yourself? We'll figure out what we want." There it was, another small exclusion, another tiny way of making me feel separate from the family unit. I ordered my usual chicken parmesan, watching as the 3 of them huddled together over their menus, whispering and giggling like schoolchildren planning a prank. And maybe they were. While we waited for our food, I tried to engage Ethan in conversation about school, but he seemed distracted, constantly looking to his parents for some kind of signal. Sarah kept checking her phone, and Michael drummed his fingers on the table with nervous energy. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and I had the growing sense that I was about to become the unwitting star of some kind of performance. If you've ever walked into a room and felt like everyone was talking about you just before you arrived, then you know that prickly feeling I had crawling up my spine. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. And if you're watching this video because you've experienced family betrayal yourself, then please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear this story. Because what happened next was a masterclass in how the people closest to you can orchestrate your public humiliation. Our food arrived, and for a few minutes, we ate in relative silence. But I could feel the tension building, like the atmospheric pressure before a tornado. Michael kept glancing at his watch. Sarah was filming everything with her phone, claiming she wanted to capture family memories, though she'd never done that before. Ethan was barely touching his food, too excited or nervous to eat. Then Michael cleared his throat and looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, almost predatory. "Dad, we need to talk about something." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. "What about?" "Well, it's about these Sunday lunches. About expectations." I set down my fork, my appetite suddenly gone. "What kind of expectations?" Sarah jumped in, her voice artificially sweet. "We just think it's important that everyone understands their role in the family dynamic, you know? Especially when it comes to decision-making and influence." I looked around the table, trying to understand what was happening. "I'm not sure I follow." That's when Ethan spoke up, and his words were so rehearsed, so clearly coached, that I knew immediately this whole thing had been planned. "Grandpa, Mom and Dad have been talking, and they think maybe you give too much advice about things you don't understand anymore." The kid was 12 years old, but he was speaking like he was reading from a script. His parents had obviously prepared him for this moment, fed him lines, turned him into their weapon of choice for delivering a message they didn't have the courage to deliver themselves. "Things I don't understand?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael leaned forward, his eyes bright with something that looked dangerously close to excitement. "Dad, you have to admit, the world has changed a lot since you were relevant. Technology, business, parenting, it's all different now. Maybe it's time you accepted that your opinions aren't as valuable as they used to be." The restaurant continued buzzing around us, other families enjoying their meals, completely unaware that mine was being systematically destroyed. I felt like I was underwater, everything muffled and distant except for the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. But this was just the warm-up. They were building to something bigger, something that would require their 12-year-old boy to deliver the killing blow. And I was about to find out exactly how far they were willing to go to put me in what they considered my proper place. I stared at my son across that table, trying to process what he just said. "Not as valuable as they used to be." The words echoed in my head like a death sentence. This was the same boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the same young man I'd stayed up all night with when he was sick, the same son I'd mortgaged my future to send to college. "Michael," I said carefully, "what exactly are you trying to tell me?" Sarah's phone was still recording, and now I realized why. They wanted to capture this moment. They wanted evidence of whatever they were about to do to me. "What we're trying to say, Dad," Michael continued, his voice gaining strength and confidence, "is that maybe it's time you stopped acting like you're still the head of this family. You're retired now. You're not contributing anymore." The word contributing hit me like a physical blow. I thought about the check I'd written just last month to help with Ethan's soccer league fees. I thought about the weekend I'd spent helping Michael install new gutters on his house. I thought about the countless times I'd babysat Ethan while they went out to dinner or took weekend trips. But apparently, none of that counted as contributing. "I see," I said, though I didn't see at all. I was lost, adrift in a conversation that felt like it was happening to someone else. "And you felt the need to discuss this here? In public?" "We thought it would be better to be clear about expectations," Sarah said, still recording. "So there's no confusion going forward." That's when I noticed other people in the restaurant were starting to pay attention. The couple at the table next to us had stopped talking and were clearly listening. The family in the booth behind Michael kept glancing over. Even Tony, our waiter, was hovering nearby, pretending to clean tables while obviously eavesdropping. They'd chosen this public venue deliberately. They wanted an audience for my humiliation. "What kind of expectations?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Ethan looked at his parents, and Michael gave him an encouraging nod. This 12-year-old boy, my grandson, the child I'd held as a baby and pushed on swings and cheered for at soccer games, took a deep breath and prepared to deliver the line they taught him. "Grandpa," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the restaurant, "why should we listen to someone so useless?" The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to go quiet, as if everyone had heard what just happened and was waiting to see how I would respond. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing my lungs in a vice. My hands started shaking, and I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. But what came next was even worse than the words themselves. Michael and Sarah burst into laughter. Not polite chuckles or embarrassed giggles, full-throated, delighted laughter, as if their son had just delivered the punchline to the funniest joke they'd ever heard. Sarah laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. Michael slapped the table and shook his head in apparent amazement at his son's cleverness. And Ethan, my grandson, grinned with pride at their approval, like a performer who'd just nailed his big scene. The couple at the next table was staring openly now. The woman looked horrified, but the man seemed almost entertained, as if he was watching a reality TV show unfold in real time. Behind Michael, a teenage girl was actually recording the whole thing with her phone, probably planning to post it on social media later. I sat there, a 63-year-old man, being publicly mocked by my own family while strangers watched and recorded. The humiliation was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. When their laughter finally died down, Sarah wiped her eyes and smiled at me with false sympathy. "Oh, come on, Frank. Don't look so serious. Ethan was just being honest. Kids say the funniest things, don't they?" "Yeah, Dad," Michael added, still chuckling. "You have to admit, he's got a point. When was the last time you actually contributed something useful to a family discussion?" I looked around the restaurant, at all the faces turned toward our table, and realized that this wasn't just a family conversation that had gotten out of hand. This was a planned performance, a deliberate destruction of my dignity in front of as many witnesses as possible. They'd dressed up for it. They'd chosen the busiest restaurant in town. They'd coached my grandson on exactly what to say and when to say it. Sarah had been recording the whole thing from the beginning. They'd even somehow arranged for other customers to be positioned where they could see and hear everything. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was premeditated character assassination. "You know what?" I said, my voice surprisingly steady given the storm raging inside me. "You're right." They looked surprised. I think they'd expected me to argue, to defend myself, to give them more material for their little show. "I am useless," I continued, reaching for my wallet. "At least, I'm useless to this family. So let me do you all a favor and remove my useless presence from your lives." I threw a $50 bill on the table, more than enough to cover my meal, and stood up. My legs felt shaky, but I managed to walk out of that restaurant with whatever dignity I had left intact. Behind me, I heard Michael say something about me being too sensitive, followed by more laughter. But I didn't turn around. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing the tears that were burning behind my eyes. I made it to my car before the full weight of what had just happened hit me. My own son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd supported through every crisis in his adult life, had orchestrated my public humiliation. He'd used his own child as a weapon against me, turned my grandson into an instrument of cruelty. And for what? What had I done to deserve this? What crime had I committed besides growing old and wanting to spend time with my family? As I sat in that parking lot, watching other families come and go from the restaurant, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to just disappear quietly like they wanted. I wasn't going to fade away into the background and pretend this never happened. They wanted to know why they should listen to someone they considered useless? Fine. I was going to show them exactly what this useless old man was capable of. But first, I had some research to do. The drive home from that restaurant was the longest 12 minutes of my life. I kept replaying the scene in my head, Ethan's rehearsed cruelty, the orchestrated laughter, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. By the time I pulled into my driveway, The shock had begun to crystallize into something else entirely, a cold, calculating fury that surprised me with its intensity. I sat in my car for another 10 minutes, staring at the house Helen and I had called home for 37 years. The garden she'd loved was still there, though I'd let it get a bit wild since her passing. The front porch where we'd spent countless evenings talking about our dreams, our fears, our children's futures. This house represented everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, everything I'd hoped to pass on to the next generation. And my son, the beneficiary of all that work and sacrifice, had just publicly declared me worthless. But as I sat there, something Helen used to say kept echoing in my mind. Frank, when people show you who they really are, believe them the first time. I'd always admired her ability to see through people's facades, to recognize manipulation and deception before I even knew it was happening. She tried to warn me about Michael's selfishness over the years, about Sarah's calculating nature, about the way they treated our generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift. I'd dismissed her concerns as maternal worry, but now I wondered what else she'd seen that I'd been too blind to notice. Once inside the house, I did something I hadn't done since Helen's funeral. I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and pen. If this was war, and after what happened today, I was pretty sure it was, then I needed intelligence. I needed to understand exactly who I was fighting and what weapons they might use against me. I started with what I knew for certain. The Sunday lunch ambush hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned, choreographed, and executed with precision. That meant they'd been discussing me behind my back for weeks, maybe months. It meant they'd coached Ethan on exactly what to say and when to say it. It meant they'd chosen that particular restaurant, on that particular Sunday, for maximum humiliation. But why? What did they hope to accomplish by destroying me so publicly? As I sat there sipping bourbon and thinking, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael's name, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Dad, look, I think maybe you overreacted a little bit today." No apology in his voice, just irritation that I hadn't played my assigned role properly. "Did I? Come on, you know Ethan was just being a kid. Sarah and I weren't laughing at you, we were laughing at him. You know how kids are, they say whatever pops into their heads." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired his technique. Almost. "I see," I said. "So you're telling me that what happened today was completely spontaneous? That you didn't coach him on what to say?" A pause. Just long enough to confirm my suspicions. "Of course we didn't coach him, Dad. Jesus, what kind of people do you think we are?" "The kind of people who orchestrate their aging father's public humiliation for entertainment," I thought. But I didn't say it out loud. "Well, then I guess I misunderstood the situation," I said instead. Another pause. He'd expected me to argue, to defend myself, to give him more opportunities to gaslight me. "Look, why don't you come over for dinner this week? Sarah's making that pot roast you like, and we can all talk about this like adults." "That sounds nice," I lied. "When were you thinking? How about Wednesday? Around 6? I'll be there." After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and smiled for the first time since leaving that restaurant. Michael thought he'd successfully manipulated me, convinced me that I'd overreacted to an innocent family moment. He thought I was still the same naive, trusting father who'd been writing checks and making excuses for his behavior for years. But that man had died in Romano's restaurant today. The man who just agreed to come to dinner on Wednesday was someone entirely different. I spent the next 3 days doing something I'd never done before, investigating my own family. I started with social media, creating fake accounts so I could browse their profiles without them knowing. What I found there made my blood run cold. Sarah had posted photos from our Sunday lunch, pictures of the 3 of them laughing while I sat alone on the other side of the booth, looking confused and hurt. The caption read, "Family lunch with Frank? Some people just don't know when to retire from being relevant. #family drama #boomers gonna boom." The post had dozens of likes and comments, most of them from people I didn't recognize making jokes at my expense. But some of the comments were from people I didn't know, neighbors, former colleagues, even my own brother's wife, all of them laughing along with the mockery of a man they'd known for decades. Michael's Facebook page was even worse. He'd been posting about me for months, sharing funny stories about my attempts to stay involved in family decisions, mocking my suggestions about everything from Ethan's education to their financial planning. Each post painted me as an out-of-touch old fool who couldn't accept that his time was over. But the worst discovery was on Ethan's Instagram account. My 12-year-old grandson had been posting TikTok-style videos making fun of Grandpa Frank, imitating my voice and mannerisms for the entertainment of his friends. In one video, he pretended to be me giving outdated advice about computers. In another, he mocked the way I told stories about the good old days. They hadn't just humiliated me in that restaurant. They'd been humiliating me online for months, turning me into a running joke for their social media followers. I sat there in my kitchen, scrolling through post after post, feeling like I was discovering that my entire family had been leading double lives. To my face, they'd been polite, tolerant, even affectionate. But behind my back, they'd been treating me like a figure of ridicule, a source of entertainment, a burden to be endured and mocked. The bourbon wasn't helping anymore. I needed something stronger than alcohol to deal with this level of betrayal. I needed a plan. That's when I remembered something Helen had told me years ago, back when Michael was in college and we'd discovered he'd been forging our signatures on checks. "Frank," she'd said, "sometimes the only way to deal with a manipulator is to become better at manipulation than they are." I disagreed with her then. I'd believed that honesty and good intentions would always win out in the end. But Helen had been right about Michael's character, just like she'd been right about so many other things I'd been too stubborn or naive to see. It was time to stop being naive. It was time to start being strategic. Wednesday's dinner was going to be very interesting. Wednesday arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Ohio, the kind of perfect evening that makes you want to sit on the porch with a cold beer and watch the sunset. Instead, I was preparing for what I now knew would be another carefully orchestrated performance by my son and his family, only this time, I was going to be ready for them. I'd spent the past 3 days studying everything I'd learned about their social media campaigns against me, and I'd come to a startling realization: this wasn't just casual mockery. This was systematic character assassination with a specific purpose. They weren't just entertaining themselves at my expense. They were building a public narrative that painted me as an irrelevant, out-of-touch burden who needed to be managed rather than respected. The question was why? What did they hope to accomplish by destroying my reputation so thoroughly? I dressed carefully for dinner, choosing clothes that would photograph well if Sarah decided to document this evening like she had our restaurant ambush. But hidden in my jacket pocket was my phone, set to record audio. If they wanted to play games with documentation, I was going to play too. Michael and Sarah's house was a testament to financial priorities I'd never understood. They lived in a subdivision where every home looked identical except for minor variations in shutters and landscaping, the kind of place where conformity was enforced by homeowner association rules and social pressure. Their mortgage was crushing. I knew because I'd co-signed for it, but the address impressed their friends and colleagues, which seemed to matter more to them than financial security. Sarah answered the door wearing an apron that had clearly never been used for actual cooking, her smile as artificial as the seasonal decorations flanking their front entrance. "Frank, you look wonderful. Come in, come in. Dinner's almost ready." The house smelled amazing, I had to admit. Whatever she'd prepared had been simmering all day, filling the air with rich, savory aromas that reminded me of the meals Helen used to make when Michael was young. For just a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the family dinners we used to have, back when love felt unconditional and conversation didn't feel like walking through a minefield. Michael appeared from the living room, beer in hand, wearing the kind of casual confidence that comes from believing you've successfully manipulated someone. "Dad! Glad you could make it. Want a beer?" "That would be nice," I said, following him into their kitchen. Everything was spotless, staged like a magazine photo shoot. No evidence of actual cooking anywhere, which made me wonder if the amazing smells were coming from takeout containers hidden somewhere out of sight. Ethan was at the kitchen island, allegedly doing homework but actually playing games on his tablet. He glanced up when I entered, and for just a moment, I saw something like guilt flash across his face before it was replaced by practiced indifference. "Hi, Grandpa," he said, his voice neutral. No warmth, but no hostility either. Just the tone you'd use with a stranger you were forced to acknowledge. "Hello, Ethan. How was school today?" "Fine." He didn't look up from his tablet again. Sarah bustled around the kitchen, clearly performing domesticity rather than actually cooking. "Frank, why don't you sit down and relax? Michael, get your father that beer. Ethan, put the tablet away and help me set the table." It was all very choreographed, very normal looking. The perfect family dinner scene, staged for my benefit. But I'd learned to look for the tells, the small signs that revealed the performance underneath. Michael's beer was already open and half empty, which meant he'd been drinking before I arrived, liquid courage for whatever they had planned. Sarah kept checking her phone, probably coordinating with someone or monitoring social media responses to whatever they were about to do. And Ethan kept glancing at his parents, waiting for some kind of signal. "So, Dad," Michael said as we settled around their dining room table, "Sarah and I have been talking about Sunday, and we want you to know there are no hard feelings." "That's generous of you," I replied, cutting into what was actually a very good pot roast. Definitely homemade, which surprised me. "We know family dynamics can be complicated," Sarah added, "especially when people are adjusting to new roles." There it was, the same condescending tone from Sunday, wrapped in fake sympathy. They were setting me up for something again. "New roles?" I asked, playing dumb. Michael and Sarah exchanged a look, and I knew we were approaching the main event. "Well, Dad, we've been thinking about your situation. Living alone in that big house, not having much to do now that you're retired. It can't be easy." I took another bite of pot roast, chewing slowly while I waited for them to reveal their real agenda. "The thing is," Sarah continued, "we worry about you. That house is so big, so expensive to maintain. And now that you're on a fixed income." There it was. The house. Helen's garden. 37 years of memories and hard work and the equity we built together. That's what this was really about. "Are you suggesting I should sell?" I asked. "Not suggesting exactly," Michael said quickly. "Just exploring options. There are some really nice senior communities around here. Places where you could have people your own age to talk to, activities to keep you busy, medical care nearby if you need it." Senior communities. Assisted living. They wanted me warehoused somewhere convenient, somewhere that would free up the house and the money it represented. "I see," I said. "Have you looked into any of these communities?" "Actually," Sarah said, pulling out a folder I hadn't noticed before, "we picked up some brochures. Just to give you an idea of what's available." She spread glossy pamphlets across the table like a real estate agent presenting options. Shady Acres. Sunset Manor. Golden Years Residence. All the euphemistic names that meant one thing: places where families put elderly relatives they no longer wanted to deal with. "These look very nice," I said, flipping through the brochures. "Expensive, though." "Well, that's the beauty of it, Dad. If you sold the house, you'd have more than enough to cover the costs. And the money you don't spend on living expenses could be, well, it could be put to better use." Better use. Like paying off their crushing mortgage, I realized. Like funding Ethan's college education. Like subsidizing the lifestyle they couldn't actually afford on Michael's marketing salary. They weren't just trying to get rid of me. They were trying to get their hands on my house, my savings, my life insurance, everything Helen and I had worked for. And they were packaging it as concern for my well-being. "This is very thoughtful of you both," I said, closing the brochures. "Mind if I ask what brought this on?" Another exchange of glances. The signal I'd been waiting for. "Well, Grandpa," Ethan said, clearly reciting rehearsed lines again. Mom and Dad think you might be happier around people who understand you better. People your own age who like to talk about old stuff. Old stuff. Like the stories I'd told about building this family from nothing. Like the sacrifices I'd made to give them the opportunities they now took for granted. That's very considerate, I said. Then I looked directly at Michael. Son, can I ask you something? Of course, Dad. Do you remember when you were 25 and you got fired from your first real job? His face went pale. Sarah's smile faltered. Ethan looked confused. Dad, I don't think. Because I remember. I continued. I remember you calling me at 2 a.m, crying because you thought your life was over. I remember driving to your apartment and finding you drunk and talking about how you'd never amount to anything. Dad, please. I remember spending the next 3 months helping you find a new job, updating your resume, practicing interview questions with you until you got it right. I remember co-signing for this house when the bank said your credit wasn't good enough. I remember. Stop, Michael said, his voice sharp. Just stop. The mask had slipped. The careful performance had cracked, revealing the ugly truth underneath. This wasn't about my well-being at all. This was about greed, pure and simple. They wanted what I had, and they were willing to destroy me to get it. You want me out of that house, I said quietly. You want access to my money. And you're willing to gaslight me, humiliate me publicly, and use your own son as a weapon to get what you want. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's phone was in her hand. Had she been recording this too? Michael's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. And Ethan looked genuinely confused, as if he was finally beginning to understand that he'd been used as a pawn in his parents' scheme. Dad, Michael said finally, his voice dangerously low. I think you should leave. I think you're right. I stood up, leaving the brochures scattered across their table like evidence of their betrayal. Thank you for dinner, Sarah. It really was excellent. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Michael? Next time you want to manipulate someone, you might want to make sure they don't have access to the internet. Your social media posts about me were enlightening. The look of horror that crossed their faces told me everything I needed to know. They'd thought they were so clever, so careful. They had no idea I'd discovered their months-long campaign of digital humiliation. As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Helen's death: clarity. Perfect, crystalline clarity about exactly what needed to happen next. They wanted to play games? Fine. But they were about to learn that some games have consequences they never saw coming. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of purpose I hadn't felt in years. While my coffee brewed, I sat at Helen's old desk, the one she'd used for paying bills and writing letters, and began planning what I privately started calling Operation Respect. If you've ever been pushed so far that you discovered a side of yourself you didn't know existed, then you understand what I was feeling. That cold, calculating anger that burns steady instead of hot. That clarity that comes when you finally stop making excuses for people who've shown you exactly who they are. My first call was to James Morrison, my lawyer and one of the few friends I had left who'd known Helen and me as a couple. Jim had handled our wills, our estate planning, and various legal matters over the years. More importantly, he was someone I trusted completely, a rarity in my world these days. Frank, he said when his secretary put me through, how are you holding up? I know these first couple of years without Helen can be rough. Actually, Jim, that's why I'm calling. I need to make some changes to my will and estate planning. Some significant changes. There was a pause. What kind of changes? The kind that might surprise some people. Do you have time to meet today? 2 hours later, I was sitting in Jim's office, explaining the situation without mentioning my plans for revenge. I simply told him that I'd had some family issues that made me want to reconsider my current arrangements. So let me understand this, Jim said, leaning back in his leather chair. You want to remove Michael as your primary beneficiary and executor? That's correct. And you want to establish a charitable foundation instead? With very specific parameters, yes. I'd spent the morning researching charitable giving, and what I'd discovered was fascinating. With proper planning, I could ensure that my money went to causes I actually cared about while making it virtually impossible for Michael and Sarah to contest the will successfully. Frank, I have to ask, are you sure about this? Family disputes over inheritance can get very ugly, and once these documents are signed and filed, they're not easy to change. Jim, my family has already gotten very ugly. I'm just making sure my final wishes reflect reality instead of wishful thinking. Over the next 2 hours, we restructured my entire estate. The house would go to a land trust dedicated to preserving green spaces. Helen would have loved that. My savings would fund scholarships for first-generation college students who actually appreciated the opportunities they were given. My life insurance would support a local food bank. Michael and Sarah would get exactly what they told me I was worth, nothing. But that was just the legal foundation. The real plan was much more sophisticated. You see, I'd learned something important from studying their social media attacks. In today's world, reputation is everything. They'd spent months destroying mine online, turning me into a joke among people who'd once respected me. But two could play that game, especially when one of the players had nothing left to lose. My next stop was the library, where I spent 3 hours learning about digital marketing, social media strategy, and something called viral content creation. The librarian, a young woman named Jessica who probably wasn't much older than Ethan, was incredibly helpful once I explained that I was trying to understand how my grandson's generation communicated. Mr. Henderson, she said, you'd be amazed how quickly the right story can spread online. Especially if it's emotionally compelling and taps into something people already care about. What kinds of things do people care about? I asked. Family drama, definitely. Stories about respect and disrespect. Generational conflicts. Oh, and anything involving elderly people being mistreated. That always gets people angry. Perfect. That evening, I created something I never thought I'd have, a social media presence. Not under my real name, of course. I opened accounts as Ohio Grandpa 63, close enough to my real identity that people would believe the story, but anonymous enough to protect me from immediate retaliation. My first post was simple. What would you do if your own family publicly humiliated you in a restaurant? I attached a photo, not of the actual incident, but a stock image of an elderly man sitting alone at a table while a younger family laughed in the background. Within hours, the post had dozens of responses, mostly from people sharing their own stories of family betrayal and offering support. But I was just getting started. Over the next week, I began documenting my story online, piece by piece. I shared screenshots of Michael's Facebook posts mocking me, with names blurred out, of course. I posted about the dinner where they tried to pressure me into assisted living. I wrote about the pain of discovering that people you've loved and supported for decades see you as nothing more than a source of money. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people shared their own experiences with ungrateful children and greedy relatives. Local news outlets picked up the story. Senior advocacy groups started following my account. #RespectYourElders began trending in Ohio. But the most satisfying response came from people who knew Michael and Sarah personally. Their neighbors, colleagues, and friends began reaching out privately, sharing their own concerns about the couple's behavior and their treatment of me. It turned out I wasn't the only person they'd mistreated. Sarah had a reputation for being demanding and entitled among the other parents at Ethan's school. Michael had burned bridges at work with his arrogance and his habit of taking credit for other people's ideas. Their financial struggles were common knowledge among their social circle, along with whispers about how they'd been pressuring me for money. The digital campaign was working better than I'd hoped, but it was still just phase 1. Phase 2 required something more personal, more immediate. Something that would force them to confront the consequences of their choices in real time. That's when I decided to attend Ethan's next soccer game. I hadn't been to one of his games since the restaurant incident, and I knew my absence had probably been explained away as more evidence of my selfishness or irrelevance. But I also knew that showing up unexpectedly would create exactly the kind of uncomfortable public moment they'd used against me. The difference was, this time, I'd control the narrative. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, perfect weather for youth soccer. I dressed carefully, nice slacks, a sweater Helen had bought me for Christmas 2 years ago, comfortable shoes for walking across the field. I looked like exactly what I was, a proud grandfather coming to support his grandson. The soccer complex was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Multiple games happening simultaneously, parents clustered in lawn chairs along the sidelines, kids running around with boundless energy. It was the kind of wholesome family scene that reminded me why I'd worked so hard to build something worth passing down to the next generation. Michael and Sarah's reaction when they saw me was priceless. Sarah actually dropped her coffee cup, and Michael looked like he'd seen a ghost. They were sitting with their usual group of soccer parents, probably enjoying their role as the entertaining couple with the crazy old father who'd finally been put in his place. But now that crazy old father was walking directly toward them, and everyone was watching to see what would happen next. "Hello, Michael." "Sarah." I nodded politely as I set up my own lawn chair just close enough to their group to be part of the conversation, but far enough away to maintain my dignity. "Dad," Michael said, his voice tight with tension. "What are you doing here?" "Watching my grandson play soccer," I replied calmly. "Same as you." The other parents were clearly sensing drama, but they weren't sure what kind yet. I could see them exchanging glances, trying to figure out the family dynamics playing out in front of them. That's when Ethan scored a goal. When Ethan scored that goal, something beautiful happened. For just a moment, he forgot about the manufactured family drama and became what he really was, a 12-year-old boy who'd just done something amazing. His face lit up with pure joy as he ran toward the sidelines, arms raised in triumph, looking for approval from the people who mattered to him. His eyes found mine first. "Grandpa!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the field over the cheers of other parents. "Did you see that? Did you see my goal?" I stood up and clapped, my heart swelling with genuine pride. "I saw it, buddy! Beautiful shot!" For that perfect moment, we were just grandfather and grandson, connected by love and shared excitement. The months of manipulation, the coached cruelty, the public humiliation, none of it mattered. This was who we really were when nobody else was pulling the strings. But then Ethan's eyes shifted to his parents, and I watched the joy drain from his face as he remembered he wasn't supposed to be happy to see me. The confusion that crossed his features was heartbreaking, the look of a child caught between conflicting loyalties, unsure which emotion he was allowed to feel. Michael and Sarah were staring at their son with expressions I'd never seen before, something between panic and fury. They'd spent months programming him to see me as irrelevant, but one moment of authentic connection had threatened to undo all their work. "Ethan!" Sarah called sharply. "Get back in there! The game's not over!" The boy's shoulders slumped as he jogged back onto the field, but he kept glancing over at me with something that looked dangerously close to hope. That's when I made my move. "Excuse me," I said to the group of parents sitting nearby, my voice loud enough to carry but not so loud as to seem aggressive. "I don't think we've met. I'm Frank Henderson, Ethan's grandfather." One of the women, a friendly-looking blonde in her 40s, smiled warmly. "Oh, we've heard so much about you. I'm Karen Mills, my daughter Sophia is on the team with Ethan. All good things, I hope," I said with a self-deprecating chuckle. "Well," Karen said, glancing uncertainly at Michael and Sarah, "we heard you'd been having some family issues." Perfect. They'd been talking about me to their friends, probably sharing the same narrative they'd been spreading online. Poor Michael and Sarah, dealing with a difficult, out-of-touch father who couldn't accept his diminished role in the family. "You know," I said, settling into my chair with the air of someone about to share a confidence, "it's funny how different people can have such different perspectives on the same situation." A couple of the other parents leaned closer, sensing a story. Michael was watching me with growing alarm, but he couldn't intervene without making a scene, and making a scene would only draw more attention to whatever I was about to say. "For instance," I continued, "my son and daughter-in-law seem to think I don't understand modern technology. But actually, I've been learning quite a bit about social media lately. Amazing what you can discover when you know where to look. I pulled out my phone, not to check it, but to let them see that I had one and knew how to use it. The gesture was subtle, but the message was clear. I wasn't the out-of-touch old man they'd been told about. Really? Asked another parent, a man I didn't recognize. My kids are always trying to teach me about that stuff. Oh, it's fascinating, I said. You can learn so much about people by what they choose to share online. Their values, their priorities, their real feelings about family members. Sarah had gone completely white. Michael was clenching his jaw so hard I was worried he might crack a tooth. They knew exactly what I was talking about, and they knew I had evidence of everything they'd been saying about me behind my back. But I wasn't done yet. The thing about social media, I continued conversationally, is that everything you post stays there forever. Even if you delete it later, there are ways to recover it. Screenshots, archived pages, that sort of thing. It's like having a permanent record of your true character. The group was hanging on every word now, clearly sensing that something significant was happening but not sure what. Michael looked like he was about to explode, but Sarah grabbed his arm, probably warning him not to make things worse. That's when Karen asked the question I'd been hoping for. Frank, what exactly happened between you and your family? We've heard Michael's side, but... I took a deep breath, as if the story was painful to tell. Which, in many ways, it was. Well, Karen, it started about 3 months ago when I began joining them for Sunday lunch. I thought it was wonderful, quality time with my son, daughter-in-law, and grandson. What I didn't realize was that they were using those lunches to build up to something. I paused, letting the suspense build. Every parent within earshot was listening now. 3 weeks ago, they took me to Romano's, you know, that Italian place downtown, and my grandson, following what were obviously coached instructions, asked me why they should listen to someone so useless. Then Michael and Sarah laughed. Loudly. In front of the entire restaurant. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several parents gasped. Karen put her hand over her mouth in shock. The man who'd asked about technology shook his head in disgust. That's terrible, Karen said. How could they do that to you? But that wasn't the worst part, I continued. The worst part was discovering that they'd been mocking me online for months. Posting about my attempts to stay involved in family decisions, making fun of my stories about the good old days, turning me into a joke for their social media friends. By now, several people were looking at Michael and Sarah with open disapproval. This wasn't the version of events they'd been told. This wasn't the story about a difficult old man who couldn't accept that his opinions weren't welcome anymore. And then, I said, my voice getting quieter so people had to lean in to hear. They invited me to dinner Wednesday night and tried to pressure me into selling my house and moving into assisted living. Not because I need care, but because they want access to my money. The silence that followed was deafening. These were people who'd known Michael and Sarah for years, who'd watched them struggle financially, who'd probably heard them complain about money troubles and family obligations. Suddenly, a lot of things were making sense that hadn't made sense before. Frank, said a woman I'd never met. I'm so sorry. That's absolutely awful. Thank you, I said simply. I'm not telling you this to make them look bad, they've done that themselves. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that sometimes the stories we hear about family conflicts aren't complete. Michael finally couldn't take it anymore. He stood up abruptly, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Dad, I think you should leave, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The contrast couldn't have been more perfect. There I sat, calm and dignified, sharing my story with quiet pain and restraint. There he stood, aggressive and hostile, trying to silence me in front of people who were clearly sympathetic to my situation. Of course, son, I said, standing and folding my chair. I wouldn't want to make you uncomfortable. As I walked away, I heard Karen's voice behind me. Michael, is that true? Did you really do those things to your father? I didn't stay to hear his answer, but I didn't need to. The damage was done. By Monday, The story would be all over the soccer parent network, the school community, their neighborhood. Their reputation, the thing they'd worked so hard to build and maintain, was about to crumble just like mine had. But that was still just the beginning. The real reckoning was still coming. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after the soccer field incident. I was in my kitchen, making coffee and reading the newspaper like I had every morning for the past 40 years, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Henderson? This is Detective Patricia Wells with the Ohio State Police. We need to speak with you about a matter involving your son, Michael Henderson. My hand tightened around the coffee mug. What kind of matter? Sir, it would be better if we discussed this in person. Would it be possible for us to meet today? 3 hours later, Detective Wells was sitting at my kitchen table, her notebook open and her expression professionally neutral. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe Sarah's age, with sharp eyes that didn't miss much. Mr. Henderson, I want to be clear from the start that you're not in any trouble. We're here because your name has come up in connection with an investigation into your son's business practices. Business practices. The marketing firm where Michael worked, where he'd been promoted twice in the past 3 years despite what I'd always suspected was questionable competence. What kind of investigation? Financial fraud. Specifically, embezzlement and falsification of client billing records. Your son has been systematically stealing from his employer for approximately 18 months. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor. Coffee and ceramic shards spread across the linoleum Helen and I had installed together 15 years ago. I'm sorry, Detective Wells said. I know this is a shock. A shock didn't begin to cover it. Michael, my son, the boy I'd raised to value honesty and integrity, was a thief. A criminal. And suddenly, a lot of things that hadn't made sense before started clicking into place. Detective, I said, my voice barely steady. Can you tell me when this started? The theft, I mean. She consulted her notes. Our investigation suggests it began around March of last year. Small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums as he got more confident in his methods. March of last year. Just 2 months after Helen's funeral, when I'd been drowning in grief and barely functional. When Michael had started coming around more often, asking about my finances, offering to help with Helen's insurance paperwork and estate settlement. How much money are we talking about? Just over $200,000. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. $200,000. No wonder he and Sarah had been able to afford their lifestyle, their expensive dinners out, Sarah's designer clothes, that new car they'd bought last fall. Mr. Henderson, the reason we're here is that your son claims you were aware of his financial difficulties and that you encouraged him to do whatever it takes to provide for his family. He's suggesting that you were complicit in his actions. The room started spinning. Not only was Michael a thief, but he was trying to drag me down with him. He was actually claiming that I, a man who never so much as cheated on his taxes, had encouraged him to steal from his employer. Detective, I need you to understand something. I had no idea about any of this. In fact, I've been completely cut out of their financial discussions for months. We suspected as much, she said, making a note. The timing of his claims doesn't match our evidence. But I needed to ask. What happens now? He'll be arrested, probably today. There will be a trial. His employer is pursuing both criminal charges and civil recovery. The house you co-signed for will likely be seized as part of asset recovery. The house. Of course. They'd been living in a home they couldn't afford, funded by money Michael had stolen, secured by a mortgage I'd foolishly guaranteed. When this all came crashing down, I'd be liable for the debt, while they'd be left with nothing. But as I sat there among the broken pieces of my coffee mug, listening to Detective Wells explain the investigation timeline, I felt something unexpected, relief. For months, I'd been questioning my own judgment, wondering if I really was the out-of-touch, irrelevant old man they painted me as. I'd been making excuses for their behavior, trying to find rational explanations for their cruelty, telling myself that maybe I really didn't understand the modern world well enough to be useful to my family. But I hadn't been wrong about them. My instincts about their character had been accurate all along. They weren't misunderstood or struggling with generational differences. They were greedy, manipulative people who'd been systematically betraying everyone who trusted them. After Detective Wells left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the coffee stains on the floor and thinking about choices and consequences. Michael had made his choices. He'd chosen to steal from his employer. He'd chosen to humiliate me publicly. He'd chosen to use his own son as a weapon in his schemes. He'd chosen to try to implicate me in his crimes when he got caught. Now it was time for him to face the consequences. But there was still one more choice I had to make. That afternoon, I drove to Ethan's school. I waited in my car until the final bell rang and watched as kids poured out of the building, backpacks bouncing, voices carrying across the parking lot with the particular energy that only comes at the end of a school day. Ethan emerged with a group of friends, and for a moment, I just watched him being a normal 12-year-old boy. Laughing at something one of his classmates said, adjusting his backpack, completely unaware that his world was about to implode. When his friends peeled off toward their own cars, I got out of mine. Ethan. He turned, and I saw the conflict play out across his face again, the same confusion I'd witnessed at the soccer game. Part of him was genuinely happy to see me. The other part remembered he wasn't supposed to be. Grandpa? What are you doing here? I came to talk to you. About what's going to happen to your family. His face went pale. What do you mean? Your dad is in trouble, Ethan. Big trouble. There are going to be police officers, and lawyers, and probably reporters. People are going to say things about your family that will be hard to hear. I watched him processing this information, trying to understand what it meant for his world. Is this because of what I said at the restaurant? He asked, his voice small and scared. The question broke my heart. This child, this boy who'd been manipulated into being cruel, who'd been used as a weapon against me, was worried that he was responsible for whatever was happening to his family. No, buddy. This isn't because of anything you said. This is because of choices your parents made. Bad choices that have nothing to do with you. Tears started forming in his eyes. Are you still mad at me? I knelt down so I was at his eye level, my knees protesting against the hard pavement. Ethan, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I love you. I have always loved you, and I will always love you. Nothing that's happened changes that. But I was mean to you. I said those things. You said things your parents taught you to say. That's not the same as choosing to be mean. He was crying now, and I wanted nothing more than to pull him into my arms and tell him everything would be okay. But I couldn't make that promise. Things were going to get much worse before they got better. Grandpa, what's going to happen to us? I don't know, buddy. But I want you to remember something, okay? Whatever happens, wherever you end up, you can call me. Day or night, anytime you need someone to talk to or someone to help you. Can you remember that? He nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. And Ethan? You're not responsible for your parents' choices. You're a good kid who got caught in the middle of some very adult problems. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I stood up, my knees creaking, and watched as he walked toward the car where Sarah was waiting to pick him up. She was on her phone, probably talking to a lawyer, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage from Michael's arrest. She didn't even look up when Ethan got in the car, too absorbed in her own crisis to notice that her son had been crying. As I drove home, I thought about the choice I still had to make. The house they'd been living in was about to be seized. They'd have no income once Michael was fired and arrested. Sarah would probably have to find a job, assuming anyone would hire her once the story got out. They'd be facing bankruptcy, public humiliation, and quite possibly homelessness. I could help them. I had the resources to cushion their fall, to provide for Ethan's needs while his parents sorted out their legal troubles. It would be the decent thing to do, the grandfatherly thing to do. But it would also be enabling them to avoid the full consequences of their actions. It would be teaching Ethan that betrayal and cruelty could be forgiven without accountability. It would be perpetuating the cycle that had brought us to this point. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made my decision. They were going to face this alone. 6 months later, I was sitting in the same kitchen where Detective Wells had delivered the news that changed everything, reading a letter from Ethan. It had taken him this long to work up the courage to write to me, and every word was like a dagger to my heart. Dear Grandpa. It began in his careful 12-year-old handwriting. I'm sorry I haven't called you. Mom says we're not supposed to because of the lawyers, but I miss you. I wanted you to know that I understand now why you were so mad at us. I know what Dad did was wrong, and I know Mom and I were wrong too. The boy was living with Sarah's sister in Kentucky now, in a cramped apartment above a convenience store. Michael was serving 18 months in federal prison for embezzlement, and Sarah was working double shifts at a diner, trying to pay off debts that would follow them for decades. If you've ever wondered whether revenge is really sweet when you finally get it, I can tell you from experience, it's not. It's hollow and bitter and leaves you questioning whether the price of justice was worth what it cost your soul. But sometimes, justice is more important than comfort. Sometimes, the people you love most need to face consequences, even when, especially when, those consequences break your heart too. The arrest had been everything Detective Wells promised and worse. Local news outlets picked up the story. Marketing executive embezzles $200,000, blames elderly father. My social media campaign had primed the community for this revelation, and the response was swift and merciless. Michael wasn't just seen as a thief, he was seen as a man who'd stolen money and then tried to implicate his own father in the crime. Sarah's desperate attempts to maintain their image crumbled within days. The fancy house was seized. The expensive cars were repossessed. Their friends disappeared like smoke, embarrassed to be associated with the scandal. The soccer parents who'd heard my story at the game weren't surprised by the news. They'd already started distancing themselves from the family weeks earlier. But Ethan paid the highest price of all. He'd been removed from his school, separated from his friends, uprooted from everything familiar while his parents' world collapsed around him. Sarah's sister had taken him in reluctantly, more out of obligation than love, and the boy was struggling with anger, confusion, and a guilt that no child should have to carry. I keep thinking about what I said to you at the restaurant. His letter continued. I know now that Mom and Dad made me say it, but I still said it. I still hurt you. And then when everything got bad, you didn't help us like I thought you would. I was mad about that for a while, but now I think I understand. You couldn't save us from what Dad did. Nobody could. The wisdom in those words from a 12-year-old was staggering. Somehow, despite everything he'd been through, Ethan was beginning to understand concepts that many adults never grasp: accountability, consequences, the difference between love and enabling. His letter went on to describe his new life in Kentucky, a small town where nobody knew about his father's crimes, where he was just another kid from a broken family trying to fit in. Sarah visited when she could, but the 3-hour drive was expensive and difficult on her work schedule. Michael could receive letters in prison but wasn't allowed phone calls with minors. I'm doing okay in school, Ethan wrote. My aunt says I'm smart like you were when you were young. She told me you built your company from nothing and worked hard your whole life. I never knew that before. Mom and Dad never told me stories about when you were younger or what you did before I was born. I wish I knew more about you and Grandma Helen. That paragraph broke something open in my chest. This child, my grandson, had been systematically isolated from his family history, cut off from the stories and values that might have helped him understand where he came from. Michael and Sarah hadn't just used him as a weapon against me, they'd robbed him of his own heritage, his connection to the generations that came before him. Aunt Linda says maybe I can visit you this summer if Mom says it's okay. I hope so. I have a lot of questions about Grandma Helen and about you when you were young. I want to know about the construction company and how you met Grandma and what it was like raising Dad and Aunt Jennifer. Aunt Jennifer, my daughter, Michael's sister, who lived in Oregon and had been horrified by the whole situation. She'd offered to take Ethan in, but Sarah had refused, probably because Jennifer would have been a daily reminder of the family bridges Sarah had helped burn. The letter closed with words that still make me cry when I read them. I love you, Grandpa. I know I don't deserve it after what I did, but I hope you still love me too. Maybe someday we can have lunch again, just the two of us, and I can tell you about my real thoughts instead of what other people want me to say. Your grandson, Ethan. I set the letter down and walked out to Helen's garden, which I'd been tending with new purpose since the whole nightmare began. The roses she'd planted were blooming again, and the vegetable patch was producing tomatoes and peppers and the herbs she'd loved to use in her cooking. This garden was what I'd chosen to preserve instead of enabling my son's destructive behavior. This house, these memories, this connection to the woman who'd helped me understand what real love looked like, that was my legacy. Not money that could be stolen or spent, not property that could be seized by creditors, but values and stories and the kind of love that persists even when it's painful to maintain. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Jennifer in Oregon. "Dad," she said when she heard my voice, "I've been hoping you'd call. How are you holding up?" "I'm surviving," I said. "But I need to ask you something. Would you be willing to have Ethan visit this summer? Not to stay permanently, but just for a few weeks. There are things he needs to learn about this family, the good things, the parts of our history that his parents never shared with him." There was silence on the other end, and I could hear Jennifer thinking. "Dad, are you sure you're ready for that? I mean, after everything he said to you, everything that happened. Jenny, that boy is the victim in all this, not the villain. He needs to understand where he comes from, what his grandfather and grandmother stood for, what it means to be a Henderson. His parents robbed him of that knowledge, and I'm the only one left who can give it back to him. What about Michael and Sarah? They'll fight you on this. Michael is in federal prison and Sarah is working 16-hour days just to survive. Besides, I'm not asking for custody. I'm asking for the chance to spend time with my grandson and teach him about his family's real values. The ones that don't involve theft and betrayal and using children as weapons." Jennifer agreed to help arrange the visit, and over the next few weeks, she worked with Sarah's sister to coordinate what would become the most important summer of my grandson's life. But that summer was still months away, and I had work to do to prepare for it. Work that involved not just planning activities and conversations, but examining my own choices and their consequences. Because if you've stayed with me through this whole story, if you've subscribed and shared and commented because you understand what it's like to be betrayed by family, then you need to hear this final truth. Revenge might be satisfying in the moment, but healing requires something much harder than punishment. It requires forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness that pretends nothing happened or excuses inexcusable behavior, but the kind that breaks the cycle of pain and gives the next generation a chance to choose differently.